Could a new alliance be taking shape in Europe? In 2022, just before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Poland and Ukraine forged a partnership. Yet its path forward remains unclear. Does this format have a future? And what motivates each country? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. This episode is part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. In this episode, UkraineWorld's Deputy Chief Editor Anastasiia Herasymchuk spoke with James Rogers from the Council on Geostrategy in the UK, Przemysław Biskup from the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and Hanna Shelest from the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. UkraineWorld is a multilingual media about Ukraine. It is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Chief Editor of UkraineWorld. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast series was created with the support of International Renaissance Foundation. So let's start.
James, Hanna, Przemysław, welcome and thank you for joining. Poland and Britain are one of the most steadfast supporters of Ukraine. And there is this old and very well-known saying that a friend in need is a friend indeed. And that's what actually really well describes the relations of Ukraine and Poland and the UK. But today we aren't going to talk about the bilateral relations of Ukraine and the UK and Ukraine and Poland. We are going to focus on the triangle. And let's start from the basics. Like, why exactly the triangle format? What is this triangle format? And why exactly Poland, Ukraine, and the UK? James, let me address this question to you first.
Very happy to answer. So, throughout the beginning of 2022, in January, there were a number of reports that circulated in the media in Poland, in Ukraine, and in the United Kingdom, which looked at the possibility of enhanced relations between the three countries, particularly in the context of the worsening geopolitical environment and the prospective Russian action or activity in the Black Sea region. And the three foreign ministers of the three countries were said to be thinking about a new cooperation format. Now, after a number of media speculations, the Polish and the Ukrainian foreign ministers made announcements to state that this was a possible and indeed likely development. And then a few weeks later, in early February, in fact, precisely 1 week before Russia's lunge into Ukraine, the three foreign ministers got together. The British foreign minister travelled to Kiev, and there was an announcement that the three countries would build a new cooperation format that would focus on four specific things: energy security, cyber security, countering hostile disinformation, particularly from Russia, and also drumming up support for the international Crimea platform. Now, of course, the idea of this received support in the three countries for a number of different reasons, which we will probably get into in a few moments. But this sums up, I think, the initial reasoning behind the initiative. Now, of course, the war, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, then got in the way as such. And although the three countries continued to cooperate, particularly to help Ukraine in its hour of need, particularly in February and March 2022, it's probably fair to say that the trilateral cooperation format has been put to the back burner over recent years as other formats have taken the floor, such as NATO and other international cooperation formats, including the G7, which have served to support Ukraine perhaps more effectively. But nonetheless, there is this continued idea that enhanced cooperation between Britain, Ukraine, and Poland will actually benefit the three countries, and it hasn't subsided.
Well, if we are talking about the interests of all the actors within this initiative, let's specify what practical and strategic interests all the actors have, what expectations and what problems needs to be solved in terms of this cooperation, looking from the point of view of each actor. And let's look at the Polish perspective first, Przemysław.
The Polish perspective, the trilateral cooperation is extension of long-standing trends, both vis-à-vis Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Ukraine in bilateral dimension, and Britain as well. I would say that at the moment of signing of the trilateral joint statement by the foreign ministers in 2022, you could argue that this was, in a sense, an exercise in making a joint effort on the basis of the formats that has been already developed, like, for example, the Lublin triangle between Poland, Ukraine, and Lithuania. Also increasing cooperation on security and military industrial and I would say defense field with Britain after Brexit. And in that respect, it was seen very clearly as an effort to keep Britain cooperating closely with European allies despite its exit from the European Union. And after the war broke out and the political barriers, especially in other member countries, proved to be lower for initiating and speeding up the process of Ukraine's accession into the EU and prospectively also into the NATO. Poland was also very happy to engage and has been seeing a close collaboration with Britain in this respect as one of the ways to strengthen this process, especially in respect of NATO. Obviously, all those actions, they are based on the assumption that Poland would like to promote rules-based European order, both in trade and in international relations, and especially in the field of security. From that point of view, Ukraine is seen as an essential bulwark against aggressive Russian politics, which became even more so since 2022. And keeping, as I mentioned, keeping close collaboration with Britain despite Brexit.
Well, and what is Ukrainian perspective on this cooperation?
That is quite an interesting question, because it seems to me that since the beginning, when the idea been introduced by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, in 2022 till now, the idea and Ukrainian interest has transformed. Originally, that was more of the practical cooperation, the desire to set a trilateral with the countries who already been in very close contact with Ukraine, strategic partners with both. We've been developing both economic and like free trade agreements, for example, or the security agreements. That was the shared perspective of the threats, of the challenges, vis-a-vis Russia, first of all. So that was the idea of the small alliances that Ukraine at that time tried to take, and that was like Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine. There were others, so that was one of there. However, with the time, we saw that Ukraine started to pay more attention, even if the format was not formalized or institutionalized as it been expected due to the different reasons. However, when we open, for example, such a document as the working plan to the realization implementation of the strategy of the foreign policy of Ukraine for 2023-2024, we can find a particular mentioning of this triangle, which Ukraine calls alliance. So really not just the partnership, but upping the relations. And here it is written that Ukraine would like to improve and enhance cooperation in the framework of alliance Ukraine, United Kingdom, Poland, including in the questions of cybersecurity, countering hybrid threats and disinformation, energy security, enhancing defense and security, and cooperation in the framework of international organizations. And here, when we see what institutions, what agencies are in charge, we understand that under the international organizations, first of all, there are three. That is United Nations, that is the European Union, and NATO. So we definitely see how Ukraine, from originally more economic transport, connectivity, all these issues, cybersecurity and general threats is something that Ukraine added to each of the agreements at the time, turned to a little bit more profound topics, including definitely the energy security and the hybrid threats and international organizations and defense, understanding that that is the issues where we can cooperate, first of all, during the war. However, why I said that for the 3 years it's really developed, because if originally it was more of the ad hoc economic, then it turned to more of the security. So by now, considering how Ukraine developed its relations at the bilateral level with the United Kingdom and Poland, we can assume that it sees this alliance wider than just situational alliance during the war with the Russian Federation. Otherwise, it would concentrate only on the topics of defense and security and some military assistance to Ukraine. However, it looks like step by step, Ukrainian position is trying to encompass the long-term partnership and alliance with the two countries, and definitely sharing the Polish view about the necessity to keep the United Kingdom in Europe after the Brexit, because the United Kingdom always been one of the serious supporters of the Ukrainian, European, and Euro-Atlantic integration. So even if they're not part of the European Union, it's still sees and perceived as part of the European family. That's why this alliance is definitely, first of all, more Europe-centric for Ukraine.
And James, could you shed the light on the British interest within this format, please?
Yes, of course. I think the UK at this time was still in a sort of post-Brexit mindset, and it had adopted, and this was outlined in the integrated review of March 2021, a disruptive, let's say constructively disruptive foreign policy approach. And it sort of didn't hold back from being critical of countries, even its close allies in Europe, when it thought that they were making mistakes. So, for example, during the autumn of 2021, the British Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, and the British Foreign Secretary both made speeches which criticised Germany's increasing dependency on Russian hydrocarbons, particularly Russian gas, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was called out as being a strategic mistake. And also there was an increasing push to constrain Russian aggression and insurgence. This, of course, having mounted over the years since the Salisbury poisonings in the previous decade. So there was this desire to be slightly disruptive, but at the same time, there was also a desire to do things differently, to move away from the old European multilateral organizations, particularly the European Union, and to show that the UK was still a major European power that had the capacity to shape and move things. So there was a preference for minilateralism. So this led the UK to seek closer relations both with Poland and with Ukraine, as well as a number of other countries in Northern and Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states to the Nordic states, through the Joint Expeditionary Force format. Now, of course, Britain had been cultivating relations with both Poland and Ukraine prior to this. So in December 2017, there was a defence agreement signed between London and Warsaw that would facilitate closer defence cooperation between the two countries. And then again, in October 2020 with Ukraine, there was a comprehensive agreement reached that covered both economic but also security and defence elements with Ukraine. So this additional format, this minilateral format to bring Ukraine, Britain and Poland together was complementary to this, but also was disruptive to the established way of doing things, but also in a constructive way in order to constrain Russian aggression, but also to facilitate closer relations between three European countries with very similar interests. And then, of course, behind all of this, there was growing concern in London of Russian intentions. Remember that the British Defence Secretary, the British Foreign Minister, had written a series of articles in 2021 which identified Russia's growing aggression and questioned Russia's long-term intentions. And I think it was clear from September, if not October 2021, that British officials were aware, or thought at least, that it was quite likely that Russia would engage in hostile action against Ukraine in the near future. So there was a desire to provide an alternative, a bulwark, if you will, against this aggression, and to prepare the ground for the measures that would be needed in order to shore up support for Ukraine among European and other Euro-Atlantic allies, and indeed, of course, around the world.
Now, as we see, a range of strategic interests lay behind this format of cooperation, and it goes far beyond the interests of just three states, but we can see a certain kind of strategic European interests here and the interests of global security. And looking at this and taking into account all these strategic views, do we dare say that this format of cooperation could be like a step towards Europe of small alliances, or if it functions the way it was designed, it could be a model of this Europe of small alliances? Hanna, let me address this question to you first.
It is difficult to say because everything depends, first of all, on our final goals and how these goals are coordinating with the general policies of the countries involved and with the European policies in general. Because originally, that's nothing new. There always been, despite the European Union and NATO, there always been different small alliances. Some of them more formal, like Visegrad 4, some of them less formal, as just of the meetings of Weimar Trio. But the question is what type of the effect they had. Did they have any type of the joint projects inside, or they were more of the coordinating mechanisms or the forums for the leaders of the states to meet, or some of them had even the historical meaning of just remembering the old alliances and respecting them. So in our case, because the document has not been signed in 2022, and now there are discussions about returning back to the new feeling, new substance of this document, everything would depend on what is inside. Because if there are ideas of supporting European integration of Ukraine within this document, definitely it would not contradict of any other task. If it would be just narrow about some joint projects in defense production and military industry, in development of the maritime sphere, or some connectivity in terms of the transport sphere, again, that would be not an alliance, that would be just the pragmatic cooperation projects that will unite three countries. The small alliances can be in case they would put, for example, bigger goals than other projects within Europe, or even contradict to some ideas of Germany or France, of any other countries. And that can be a certain challenge for the project and for the idea of trilateral itself. Because otherwise, the question is we have Bucharest 9. Bucharest 9 is the small alliance in its kind, but it is not contradicting the membership of NATO of the states, but is seen by the members of B9 as the supplement or some kind of the avant-garde group for this. So the same theoretically can be with the trilateral of Ukraine, Poland, and the United Kingdom. Depending on how much they will be able to coordinate their plans, not only among three, but also with other partners within Europe.
Well, if we look back at the 2022, when the initiative itself was born, can we say that the concept of this trilateral format has changed after it was launched? And this milestone as the Russian full-scale aggression, invasion of Ukraine, has it somehow influenced the idea behind the trilateral format of cooperation? And how has it changed over this period of Russian full-scale aggression? Przemysław, let me address this question to you.
Yeah, I think that this would be a justified opinion. If we look back at the joint statement from February 2022, which I have already mentioned, the contents of that were, I would say, quite comprehensive by the standards of 21, 22, but they are rather modest, I would say, by comparison to what we have now as an agenda. There was mostly military cooperation, some technological cooperation, some energy cooperation, and some cyber cooperation mentioned in that statement from only 2.5-3 years ago. Whereas beginning from June 2022, we had Poland very actively helping and promoting Ukraine opening its accession process to the EU. And just that fact, in 2023, we had official opening of the negotiations, completely remodels the landscape because of that, everything that is covered by the EU, every policy field, is now a legitimate basis for cooperation within the format. Even if it hasn't been exploited yet, mostly due to the limitations put by the present very difficult situation of Ukraine as a fighting nation against Russian aggression. I would say the same fact also had very serious consequences for the UK, for the cooperation with the UK within that triangle, because despite the fact that the UK is no longer an EU member, it still has the most comprehensive trade cooperation agreement and is the most integrated external partner of the EU. So the framework of Ukraine's accession talks will also be impacting on the Ukrainian, British, and Polish-British cooperation. Apart of that, I think we have to stipulate that both Poland and the UK on the NATO side, and Ukraine from the outside as a country aspiring to join, have been doing tremendous work to promote a Ukrainian future membership of NATO and to break different taboos connected to that. And that also creates a huge, ever developing potential for ever closer cooperation. Also, the necessities connected to the war promoted different forms of cooperation that were greatly, I would say, accelerated. So, for example, we have now a fact of Ukraine's electric grid integrated into use, among others, via bridges that go for Poland. We have greatly increased integration of transportation systems. This will be an even bigger deal once the reconstruction of Ukraine starts in earnest, and that reconstruction, in terms of transportation and connectivity into infrastructure, will be based technically on EU standards. So I think the realities of the war, the aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine, were a catalyst for taking many more actions in considerably shorter time than it would otherwise happen, and also helped to break different barriers and open cooperation to the new fields, if not in reality, at least in terms of potential.
And from here, from what you've just mentioned, let's get deeper into details on prospects of this kind of cooperation. And actually, what can lay behind these formats in future, and how can this cooperation look in future? What dimensions it can bring to surface? James.
So I think one thing which I would say one area where cooperation could be taken further, and I think it's also something that has been happening over the last 2 years, is that the trilateral has served, and this sort of in some ways answers in part your previous question on a Europe of small alliances. That not necessarily will the trilateral be a small alliance as such, but it will be a kind of advocacy coalition, whereby countries, the three countries, come together to push for certain agendas to be either embraced or adopted by other entities, whether that's NATO or whether that's the G7 or whether that's the EU. Or even others beyond that, that it creates a new center of gravity for a set of ideas to not necessarily dominate, but to take their own form, take a life of their own, or even to prevent others from pushing ideas that the three countries would see as unfavourable. One only needs to think about what might have happened if the trilateral had never come into existence, had the UK, had Poland, had Ukraine not sought to be slightly constructively disruptive in the early years of 2022, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Would it have been the case that a narrative or an agenda would have taken hold across the Euro-Atlantic region that was supportive of Ukraine to the extent that it was, or would a different approach have been adopted, i.e. one not dissimilar to that like France and Germany adopted in the aftermath of Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014? Of course, that's an issue for debate and discussion, but my view is that this framework, it shows what can be achieved when countries want to be dynamic, when they want to be assertive, and when they want to push a specific narrative, and what can be achieved through that. So looking ahead, I think something very similar will prove to be successful. So it may not be the case that the trilateral, like other minilateral arrangements, and there are several in Europe indeed beyond, it might not be that it forms a tight or close alliance in a traditional sense, but rather it forms as a very flexible model that allows the three countries to come together when they need to push for certain agendas to be adopted at the Euro-Atlantic level. We've seen this, for example, over the last few years with the Tallinn pledge to provide Ukraine with modern battle tanks. We've also seen it in terms of providing Ukraine with longer range weaponry, with accelerating the provision of armaments to Ukraine, and a whole number of other areas as well. So in our report that we produced on the future of the trilateral, we came up with a number of different options, many of which were of that nature, and also to coordinate more between the three governments to serve their interests, and also to do this in a way that's reinforcing of the Euro-Atlantic order and the European order, rather than one that is kind of detrimental to it. So we should see the trilateral and other unilateral initiatives as being potentially supportive of the broader multilateral structures that the Euro-Atlantic region depends on, not least, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is utterly central to the defense of those countries that are a part of it. And in that regard, the trilateral may serve as a kind of advocacy coalition to facilitate Ukraine's accession into NATO at some point in the future. And in the interim, it could be that it helps to provide Ukraine, as I think it has through other measures, through security commitments that will help the country to eject the Russians and also to deter them from attacking in the future.
Przemysław, Hanna, if you have anything to add about the prospects of of this format, just you're welcome.
Probably a small addition that it seems to me that for the future, the three countries would need to differentiate the cooperation onto two levels and to set priorities accordingly. The first level would be strategic, and that would be more political and security spheres, where they would define the joint vision and the real alliance, how they see it with the new challenges, old challenges, threats, and the vision of the development of Europe and their relations. That can be in line with, for example, that 100 years cooperation agreement that Ukraine and Britain are currently developing. So that would be more of the strategic partnership between three countries and their joint positions within the international organizations. At the same time, there would be development at the lower level, where the three countries would be able to identify the exact concrete projects, like, for example, assisting Ukraine with the reconstruction of the ports, or joint research and development for the new type of ammunition, or the joint projects on the connectivity, building the road from Ukraine to London via Poland, or something like this. So that would go separately, and it can be not that comprehensive as the political level of the relations, and more even not ad hoc, but let's say targeted. What is the joint problem? Or what is the shared issue where the countries can unite to reach a success? And that would be more practical and more up to date, maybe even the short term or mid term development projects. When at the same time, strategic and security spheres, political strategic sphere, would always be more long term and with the longer consequences that would not depend on the political leadership at the very particular moment of the country's histories.
From my side, I would be happy to add as a kind of emphasis that this trilateral cooperation is not really an alternative to multilateral cooperation within such blocs as an EU or as the EU or the NATO, or more ad hoc formats connected to armaments program for Ukraine, coordinated by G7. But they are rather a great instrument to build up critical masses or to break barriers within those wider groupings. And this is especially important in the field of setting strategic agenda. Poland and Britain and some fellow Central European countries like the Baltic countries or Romania, these are the countries that very strongly believe in Ukraine, in theory of Ukrainian victory in the war against Russia. Unfortunately, this cannot be said about some of other partner countries within NATO or within the EU. And we see, especially among the biggest players, we see quite a lot of hesitancy about the finality, the strategic vision of the end of the war. And the best example of that is quite considerably delayed publication, preparation and presentation of the strategy for the war in Ukraine by President Biden to the Congress. So I think it has to be emphasized that the trilateral that we discussed today and other similar formats are a great way to mobilize the coalitions of the willing that build up momentum and help to mobilize those wider groupings to achieve aims connected to developing and deepening integration of Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic and European communities.
Well, and here on this view of the prospects and hopes for future fruitful cooperation between these three states, I would like to thank you for this insightful conversation, for highlighting these important issues of this partnership, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank all of you.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm the chief editor of UkraineWorld. This episode was part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.